welcome to everybody. I know most of you, I think, and probably know everybody actually, but anybody who's not familiar with what we do as the Scottish Unemployed Workers Network, we've put one of our Know Your Rights leaflets on the chair, so that's what we hand out outside the job centre. So we're a campaigning group, and we're also a self-help group and a helping other people group, and importantly discussing the issues and trying to get the key issues discussed more widely. So we're really, really pleased to have Lynne Friedli with us today. A few of us went through and heard her speak in Edinburgh the other day, and we're insistent that we needed her in Dundee as well. I hadn't realised when we invited her that she'd actually worked in Dundee before, and in fact had the good taste not only to work in Dundee but to work in Stobswell on a project called Equally Well on mental health and well-being about 3 years ago. But she spends most of her time in London, and she's involved with Boycott Workfare down there, which a lot of you will probably know the website if you haven't met the people involved. So she's both a researcher and an activist, and we're really pleased to have her. So she's going to speak for about half an hour, is it, Lynne? And then there'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions. So over to you, Lynne.
Thank you. So is it okay if I stand up?
Yeah, do that.
That's cool, is it? Okay. So it's great to be back in Dundee, and thanks very much to Scottish Unemployed Workers Network, and that's a good start, and to Sarah and Tony for inviting me. So I want to weave quite a lot of different things together, because I think when we start talking about psychology and how it's used by the state, how it's used by power, it can be quite complicated to unpick it, and it's something that touches us in a very sort of personal and I think especially harmful way. So the starting point for my own research was, which some of you may remember, George Osborne's parable of the shift worker leaving for work in the early morning darkness, while behind closed blinds the claimant, the welfare scrounger, slept away a life on benefits. And that sort of very powerful myth gained a sort of new currency. I mean, obviously the sort of the scrounger, the worker, the shirker, you know, that kind of terminology, it's not new, but that kind of myth of the claimant sleeping away a life on benefits gained political currency just at a time when actually to be unemployed was to be relentlessly busy, was to be on a treadmill of mandatory training, of forced unpaid work, but also to be on a psychological treadmill. And so what I've tried to look at is a kind of shift in conditionality. So what you have to do to get your benefits increasingly change, not just what you have to do to get your benefits, but what you have to be. And what you have to be is informed by a lot of insights from psychology. So that is really the basis for my trying to research how the state was using psychology and how psychology was operating. So I want to acknowledge the huge contribution, obviously, of Boycott Workfare, and also fellow researcher and activist Robert Stern, who's worked with me together to try and pull together the testimonies of people who've experienced various kinds of psychological coercion at the hands of the Department for Work and Pensions and its many subsidiaries. And also, I think increasingly, the contribution of grassroots unions and the mental health resistance movement, Recovery in the Bin, the user survivor movement, to trying to tease out what is happening in psychology, how it's being used, and how we can fight back against it. And the final kind of bit of the puzzle is the resurgence of anti-work politics and thinking about how psychology is making it quite difficult to be negative about work. So it's a big kind of puzzle, and I don't think I've got to the bottom of it by any means, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion with yourselves this evening. So I'm going to talk about how psychology is being used to enforce work, but also to disguise exploitation. And I think one of the special features of psychology and its power is it's strongly ideological. So it gets to you at the level of thoughts and feelings and emotions and beliefs. But of course, although it's ideological, it's underpinned by material sanctions. So it moves between the two. And we're especially seeing the use of psychology in this whole kind of psychosocial model that some of us once thought was actually quite innocent. We're seeing the use of that to dramatically increase what you have to do as a person living with health problems. Health problems now becomes your responsibility, and the psychosocial model is used to enforce that. And so there's a kind of rhetoric of empowerment and emancipation, but actually the psychosocial model, you're sick, it's your responsibility to recover. And that whole rhetoric, the positive thinking, the you're only as sick as you feel, is being used to justify major cuts in the incomes of people who are sick and also people with disabilities. So that's what I think is happening. So I'm going to talk very specifically initially about psycho-compulsion in Workfare and its role in what I would say disciplining and punishing claimants, but also psychology's role in kind of enforcing the work ethic. So by that I mean, psychology's contribution to the work is wonderful story. Work is so good for you that it doesn't matter if you're paid, because work is a kind of own reward. And that's quite closely related to the rise of the work cure. So whatever's wrong with you, no matter how, you can never be too sick, but work can do you good. And underpinning all this stuff are psychological insights. So they're insights drawn very specifically from different branches of psychology, particularly positive psychology. And I guess the sort of epitome of that is the shift from the sick note to the fit note. And psychology and psychology professionals, and when I say psychology, obviously it's not an abstract thing. There are people who work in psychology who are contributing to this, have designed the concept of the fit note, which is all about your responsibility to recover, and the role of positive thinking and a good attitude and good behaviour in all of that. So before I talk in more detail about what I think is going on in Workfare and what some of you may well have experienced, I just want to say that I think it's useful to think about the similarities in psychological coercion experienced by both claimants and workers, especially precarious workers. And so some of what I'm describing that is happening to claimants is also happening in the workplace, particularly amongst agency workers, workers in precarious positions. So especially for people who are sort of on the border zone between work and welfare, which many people experience. And so, on the one hand, unemployment is now perpetual, relentless job seeking, and that has a very strongly, I would argue, strongly psychological component. You have to show that you're motivated, that you're positive, that you're willing to work, that you have a good attitude, and all those things. So, and that is all supervised and scrutinised and managed by the welfare to work industry, who have the contracts to supervise all of this. But that whole kind of relentless treadmill of getting yourself into the kind of approved headset doesn't end when you get a job. And now we can see that, like for example in the language of universal credit and so-called in-work support. And one of the things that happens things, what's happened to me in doing this kind of research, is you start to see how really quite subtle shifts in language represent a really major change. And one of the ones that I particularly noticed recently in the contracts is that universal credit, they're not going to target low pay. That might sound a bit too much like a socialist campaign. So what they're now targeting is people who are low earners. And there's a very significant shift there, because low pay is like something you can campaign around and it's somebody's fault and you have to engage with power. But people who are low earners have a few problems. You know, the sort of person who is a low earner. And then you can start saying, you know, what are the characteristics of these people who are low earners? And that is how I think it operates. And that is, I think, its danger. And that is, I think, what we need to deconstruct. And that is why, when you're isolated in the face of this kind of stuff, you feel very vulnerable. And I consider it to be particularly pernicious. Well, obviously, I mean, that will be my view. So there's the whole kind of wellness and well-being industry, which I think, coming back to what's happening to workers, is kind of expanding the boundaries of what's managed at work to attitude and personality. So, you know, you can no longer be a miserable bastard at work. You know, there is no role for that person. The person who can always see problems, the person who's always negative, that person who actually in Scottish culture had an honourable and important role to play. No, that's no longer allowed. And so you can see the expansion of human resources into kind of personality management. And I was talking in Glasgow a couple of years ago when I was first doing this research as a group of social workers, and they said to me that they'd actually been told, don't come in here with problems, come here with solutions. And so at their team meetings, they were actually not allowed to raise problems. And this was all part of the sort of positive focus. So it is like a kind of, it's like an epidemic. So what I think's going on there is, whether it's managing the personality of claimants or workers, it's a kind of attempt to bring your whole self into productivity. It's a kind of all-purpose positivity that is harvested for profit, whether that's, you know, in the shop floor of a supermarket or down the job centre. And it's quite interesting. Ivor Southwood, who writes a lot about agency workers, he says that, you know, happiness is being recast as a disciplinary issue. And so he talks about that now. If you go into work and you say you've got a problem, then they go, oh, you're not happy. And then you're punished for not being happy. So, for example, you don't get the same kind of shift, sort of non-happy workers. But there's something very specific, isn't there, about calling a complaint or a demand not happy. So this is Pan Hustev. So he's done this brilliant YouTube piece giving an account of what happened to him when a mandatory work activity compliance doubt was raised, when he refused to state that he was happy. Okay, so they sent him off to a charity shop and he was required to say that he was happy. So this is what he says. You're requesting from me to be positive about something negative that happened to me, something negative perpetrated against me. I'm requested to do MWA. I'm obliged to do it by law. I'm going to do it. But demanding from me to declare that I'm happy to do it, you're not going to get that from me. So that's refusal to state that you're happy as an act of resistance. I think that's a very, very significant moment, significant historical moment. And of course he was sanctioned. And that's the first very specific linguistic example that I have of that. So I guess the other side of all of this, is this okay so far? I mean, feel free to interrupt me if anybody wants to, or if anything isn't clear. I mean, I will just say also that, I mean, the Department for Work and Pensions has called my research highly misleading, because they object to the nature of the testimonies and the way that they were gathered. I will say that I'm going to give you a small number of quotes, but that painstaking research on the extent of psychological coercion has been conducted. So these aren't just isolated. There are enough of these examples, I think, to constitute a very marked trend in what is happening to people. And I'll be very interested if anybody here has had similar experiences. So I think this is a kind of central neoliberal tactic, which is to disguise economic power, so that conflict is personalised and internalised, and people will be familiar with that, especially in the workplace. And particularly, and I think it's very, very noticeable in Scotland, is the growing tendency to psychologise inequalities. So that inequalities, they're seen less and less in terms of issues of power and privilege, and much more in terms of attitude and personality. So you've your Glasgow Centre for Population Studies, and Miss Noma, if ever I heard one, talking about, the Scottish lack of, the Glaswegian ostensible lack of a sense of coherence and, negative thinking and, failure to be truly aspirational. I mean, what this is really about is failure to be cheerfully complicit in your own subordination. That's all that it boils down to. But, this is really the kind of attempt to identify. It's a class. Class is run straight through this. But the presence or absence of confidence, hope, aspiration, resilience, sense of coherence, the wholly unethical attempt to inculcate this in children and pretend that it's absence, far from being evidence of the critical thinking of Scottish traditions, but evidence of some sort of deficit. And so I describe all this as psycho-fundamentalism. And psycho-fundamentalism is when you attribute life outcomes, whether that's health or income or anything else, all down to personality. And of course what psycho-fundamentalism does is it removes class. And that's one of its major functions. So I want to come on now very specifically to my research on psycho-coercion in Workfare. And by psycho-coercion in Workfare, I mean mandatory training, so having to go on things like confidence building courses, being told that your problem is a lack of self-esteem, sort of job coaching that has a strong psychological element, psychological referral, generally for failure to comply with job centre instructions, psychometric testing, so mandatory tests that attempt to identify your strengths and weaknesses, again with a strong psychological component, and then psycho-sanctioning, which is where you are sanctioned, for example, for lack of motivation, although it's not defined, but you appear to the job centre or the provider not to be fully committed to working for nothing. So more recently, I've been looking at resistance to work itself and how these narratives that I'm describing, they're being used to undermine resistance to work and the legitimacy of refusal to work. And it's becoming the biggest taboo to declare you don't want to work. And that actually, that's very rational, given what's out there. And given the relations of subordination that work is fundamentally about. And because it's so much comfier to talk about job satisfaction than it is to talk about relations of subordination, which are encoded within every working relationship, no matter how apparently enjoyable, coming back to our earlier discussion. So I would say that psychology is at the forefront of efforts to normalise the negative aspects of the UK job market. So to normalise insecurity through a sort of very intensive rebranding exercise, which tells you that never know if you're going to get an hour's work is liberating and flexible, and that not knowing from one day to the next whether you're in a job is an opportunity. And so opportunity and liberation is how the negative sides of the job market are being rebranded, and they're being done so, aided and abetted by so-called psychological insights. So I would say we're seeing the use of psychology in state attacks, both economic and ideological, on refusal to work, as well as unemployment essentially being rebranded as a psychological disorder, and as I'll show, the blurring of health and employment. And I want to come back, because I'm being very hard on psychologists, I want to be equally hard on public health, and I will return to them. So I'm interested in and particularly being here in Dundee and with Sue, in what all these developments mean for political struggle. I'm interested in how we escalate resistance to psycho-coercion in struggles around workfare, obviously, but also in fights for better pay and better conditions. And I was very interested, we had an interesting discussion earlier, with something I wasn't aware of, which is the extent to which psychology is being used to screen out particular types of workers, so it's playing a role in blacklisting. So I think, psychology bears some considerable scrutiny in the way that it's being used. So we can talk about this more in the discussion, but one example of how we've used these different themes down south in London was a hugely successful protest against putting job coaches in GP surgeries. Now, these are job coaches employed by Remploy, which some of you may know is owned by Maximus. And it's difficult to imagine a less suitable company for providing in-work support. But we know now, when we see the term support, we know what it means. But what was interesting about that protest in terms of political struggle was that it brought together groups like Boycott, Workfare with groups who have a lot of experience of psychological coercion, so people within the mental health resistance movement, the user survivor movement, as I said before, so people who are used to unpicking what goes on in mental health services and now sort of seeing it. And so I'm pleased to see activists from disability rights and the mental health user survivor movement coming together with grassroots trade unions and people fighting workfare, like many of you here, and the tremendous contribution that the mental health user survivor movement makes, and not to mention the brilliant satire built up out of traditions around mad pride and those sorts of histories. So that's a long preamble, partly because I don't want to look at this whole topic too narrowly. But I now want to make my central case about what's happening in Workfare. So this is specifically how psychology is being used in work for your benefits programmes enforced by the threat of sanctions, or indeed actual sanctions. And as I keep coming back to, what that means is the role of psychology in disciplining and punishing people who are claiming benefits. And I think it's operating in 4 different ways. One is the role of psychology in activating people. So activating unemployed people via mandatory change your attitude, change your personality courses. So you have to go on these, but reinforced by positive messaging, so emails that you receive from Job Centre Plus or Welfare to Work providers. Not many people know that around 20,000 Job Centre staff have received specific training in behavioural interventions. So that means that people on benefits, under the guise of being made work ready, again, an entirely psychological construct. Work ready doesn't mean you suddenly get an HGV licence and can drive a big lorry. Work ready is a psychological construct, and you become work ready by being made to take part in various pointless and often humiliating psychological group activities, like building paperclip towers to demonstrate teamwork, or taking completely meaningless and unethical tests to demonstrate your strengths. All of these approaches are strongly influenced by positive psychology, the idea that if I think deeply enough about that chair, it can somehow levitate itself. And that's exactly what positive psychology is about. It's about the power of the mind over the material world. And it's important to remember that. It's a kind of psychological magic. There's also a marked excuse me, change your attitude element. In Department for Work and Pension contract specifications. So these are the contracts that are issued to the welfare to work providers. So, we all know that as claimants, you're making large amounts of money for everyone except yourself. There's a sort of massive network of providers. But in these contracts, so I quote, contractors must address negative perceptions that claimants may hold about work. Contractors must instill a positive attitude to work. And the programs that people are paid to deliver have names like Focus the Mind, Engage and Achieve Your Potential. I quote again, the course should challenge perceptions claimants may hold that employers discriminate on the grounds of age. So there's a big emphasis on basically challenging people's real evidence-based. I mean, it's actually quite ironic, isn't it? There are many courses that have a strong component which is called Understanding the Benefits of Work. So it's ironic, really. I mean, work is so wonderful, but people have to go on courses because unaccountably people don't think work is wonderful. So they have to sit there for 6 months, being explained to them how wonderful it is. But the third element of it is the use of psychology to explain unemployment, as I referred to, but also to classify claimants. And this is, again, a very damaging development. So you'll probably hear, constructs entirely made up, like psychological resistance to work. Now, the British Psychological Society, when there was a complaint by myself and others about the use of a term like psychological resistance to work, which is entirely bogus, has absolutely no function except a purely ideological one, do you know how they responded? That tests to assess psychological resistance to work must be carried out by a trained clinical psychologist. And so that is how far the professional body responsible for the ethics of psychologists is from actually analysing and critiquing what's going on. To be fair to them, I will say that with a wee bit of pressure, they have moved a little bit in their understanding. But all these constructs that also we hear health professionals bandying about, like employability, job readiness. Job readiness is a construct entirely made up to avoid paying young people wages. It allows us to have an extended period when people are doing what looks like a job, used to be called a job, but is now called an exercise in developing job readiness or work readiness. Entrenched worklessness, job search, self-efficacy. So Esther McVeigh, who's the previous Minister for Employment down south, she talked about targeting people who are less mentally fit, bewildered or despondent, or the work-resistant personality, or a willingness to violate norms concerning work, which Adam Perkins has described in the welfare tray. This is Jeremy Hunt. Those reliant on benefits lack the dignity and self-respect of those who earn all their own money, like what he did. And do you know what, comrades? A lot of this is completely laughable and very susceptible to satire, but it can also be incredibly damaging. And because of the way in which it operates and how it affects individuals, because it attacks you at a very, very personal level, I think it's just incredibly important for there to be solidarity and mobilising around these themes, which is not to say other things aren't important, but I think there's something particular. The other thing about this is that this whole kind of mythology of psychological deficit, that legitimates psychological interventions that are targeting people who are poor. And I suppose finally, and what is perhaps, it's all. I'm not going to create a hierarchy, but finally, the rise of psychological conditionality. In other words, feelings and beliefs and personality become a factor in entitlement. So the most well-known of those is lack of motivation. So some sort of job centre official or provider can decide that you're not motivated, which is never defined, and you can be sent on community work placements. But it's not just for benefit entitlement, it's also entitlement to other resources, for example, cheap food. So you need to be, I quote, motivated to make a positive change in your life, and sign up to a personal and professional development programme, a success plan, to get cheap groceries from the community shop. Now, in spite of the fact that myself and others have made many, many complaints, the very idea that somebody has to sign up, what is a positive change in your life? What is a personal success plan? When did all these concepts start gaining power, and who has the authority to enforce them? Compulsory positive effect, in other words, whistle while you work for nothing. I quote, all new starts, that's all new claimants, must attend an initial 2-week course to develop their confidence. And you can often tell when people have been on these courses, because people will start to explain their own lives in terms of lack of confidence and lack of self-esteem. And I think there are some real problems with that. We're becoming enmeshed in a discourse of psychological explanations for issues of power and privilege and exploitation. I guess it's pretty clear that all this also sort of functions to obscure the whole reality of the labour market, that kind of no pay, low pay economy, and the political choices that maintain it. And clearly the stark inequalities in the experience of work and in insecurity, everything that goes with it. It's entirely misleading to talk about work as if it benefits everybody equally, or benefits everybody at all. We know who it does benefit though, because this is a poster from Homebase. Do you have Homebase? Yeah, okay. So this is a keen manager. It's got a poster from the DWP. How the work experience programme can benefit your store. Would 750 hours with no payroll costs help your store? So we know who this whole thing benefits. I guess there's also a kind of irony in that at a time when for millions of people work isn't producing either an income you can live on or emotional satisfaction, it's being promoted as so wonderful that you don't need pay, and sort of work as the primary source of meaning and value, and also as the major route to health. And I mean that's a whole other strand, as I keep mentioning. So I think what's also happening now is there's a kind of intensive effort to escalate all this through what I would call a job centre takeover. And this is when support into work suddenly arrives in your local library, in your food bank, in your GP surgery, in a school, in previously benign so-called public spaces, suddenly become sites of getting people back to work. And that's one of the big issues that we're struggling with in London and fighting very, 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 very vociferously. And at the centre of all this is the Work and Health programme, which is replacing the Work programme. And that's aiming to merge health and employment. So if they can't get you any other way, they're going to do it through your GP. And some GPs are going to say, actually, good idea to give people support into work. The problem is at the moment is that support into work cannot be neutral if it is delivered by any agent of the Department for Work and Pensions or anybody paid by them. And so what you're seeing now is, health professionals, in my own borough, you've got health professionals introducing a raft of measures which are basically supporting the imposition of work cures. So, as Lynne said, setting employment as a health outcome, as a clinical outcome. Now, what about employment as an illness outcome? What about all the damaging effects? This idea that work is necessarily benign. And so, I mean, this is a lot. They're allowing job coaches employed by Remploy, answerable to Maximus, to directly update a patient's medical record. They're delivering, the on-prescription stuff, which you have a very honourable tradition of in Dundee, but in Dundee it's been social prescribing. In Islington it's just jobs on prescription. That's what's on offer because, of course, work is the cure-all. And so all those other things, like you might, welfare advice or housing or domestic violence or all the other things you might look at are off the agenda. And they're terms that immediately, I think, cause suspicion, like embed employment into the wiring of the healthcare system, integrating employment support into the map of medicine. So, I mean, the case for the mandatory treatment of people with long-term conditions, that was first flagged up in the Tory manifesto, some people might know. That's currently being reviewed, including whether benefit entitlement should be linked to what they call accepting appropriate treatments or support. I consider this to be very dangerous territory. I quote, "People who might benefit from treatment should get the medical help they need so they can return to work. If they refuse a recommended treatment, we will review whether their benefits should be reduced." Now, I consider those to be a serious threat, both to the independence of health professionals, but also to the human rights of patients. So it remains to be seen what is going to happen. I think the attack on people's rights, the violations of even the most fundamental ethical principles, have reached such a level that people almost have stopped reacting. Now, this letter is going out to people in work claiming universal credit, and it requires you to take part in a randomised controlled trial. You are mandated to take part. That is a complete violation of any research that could ever be approved by an ethical committee. But I will read the letter to you. So, support to help you get further in work. Dear Victoria, taking part in our new service trial. Although you've succeeded in starting work, your household income is topped up with universal credit payment. You've been selected to take part in a trial to learn how we can best support people like you too. Help you find more work or better paid work. Reduce your reliance on universal credit and encourage you to be financially independent. What does the trial involve? We'll work with you, etc., etc. Because you do still get some universal credit, you will have to take part in the trial to keep up your payments. Now, Citizens Advice Scotland commented on these trials, and what was the only thing they had to say? That they wanted the data and the findings of the trial to be made public. They didn't have, in a 15-page submission, a word to say about the ethics of forcing somebody on benefits to take part in this trial. And that is, and I hope I don't sound too screechy, but I really feel that these kind of violations are just passing us by because there's so much to struggle about. But it's a really poor show if big organisations fail to notice the escalating of mandatory requirements. And again, a number of people are trying to raise this with research bodies, people who fund this kind of research. No researcher should be participating in that trial at all. It should just be downing tools. But that hasn't happened. So, I mentioned that kind of shift from what you have to do to get your benefits to what you have to be. And psychology is are you getting restless?
No.
No. Okay, I won't go much longer. And I think what you have to be is those things I mentioned. You have to be confident, you have to be motivated, you have to be aspirational. So the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, say a positive attitude is the key foundation of employability. And as I said, that kind of the period where you acquire those characteristics is used to justify long periods of waiting for a wage. I want to now really just end in saying something so that we don't sort of feel too gloomy. I mean, there is a huge struggle and resistance around these issues, and it's growing. And I think the point that I made earlier about bringing together mental health and disability rights activists with people fighting workfare, with anti-poverty campaigners, you know, teasing out the common themes. So, you know, the fight to expose and challenge putting job coaches in GP surgeries help to expose common experiences, because in the same GP surgeries we could say, and don't use fit notes to pressurise people back to work. And then we could make links with workers fighting for proper sick pay rather than just statutory sick pay. So I think it provides a way of uniting and bringing together common themes. And so this quote from somebody who'd been through psychological coercion, he says, "What did this do to me? Well, it should have cowed me and made me compliant and dreadfully sorry. I was meant to behave myself, but it didn't. I was surprised at the level of anger that I felt. One of the things which I did do was go out and join the first campaign that would take me. I joined Boycott Workfare. I was determined to be as obnoxious as I could be." And we're seeing, you know, and I just love that word, obnoxious. So we're seeing sort of new and strengthened alliances between us, you know, sort of user survivor and around mental health. And I guess what I think is also interesting is seeing some of the resurgence of an anti-work politics and an exposure of this sort of mythology. So Cathy Weeks talks about, you know, not work perfected, but work overcome. So is the struggle for better work, or is actually the struggle for no work? And so that as we resist psycho-coercion in workfare, we also resist psycho-coercion in kind of propping up the work ethic. You've been, well, I'll just end on the final quote, which I really like, which is that insubordination to the work ethic is more subversive than ever before. We've worked enough. And that's Dalla Costa. You've been very patient. Thank you very much for your attention.